that were installed in 2019. They've worked, they've done their job, but we have also gone back to our engineering teams, and we've been meeting literally weekly for about the last 6 months after the storm events and said, this is not sustainable long term. We cannot continue to develop an emergency mitigation strategy that can be sustained over time. And we really would like to find a way to not have our impacted residences go through that same level of trauma each and every single season. And how can our internal infrastructure be designed differently to accommodate more flooding events of what could be in the future? Of course, it's unknown. We're at the mercy of Mother Nature, but we, with fairly high level of certainty, know that if it continues to do what it's doing, we're going to have a response site. So that's kind of the big background, but very importantly, and I think this is the questions that came up that were conveyed to us, we completed a feasibility study in regards to the actual wash and the relationship to the modeling. And the feasibility study came back with a few parameters, and one was to stay within the existing channel from top to bottom. We really focused on city limits from Paradise to the end. And we identified projects and we scoped and looked at all these different opportunities within the existing infrastructure. A couple, primarily Killip School and the Dorotha Crossing and the Spruce Avenue wash improvements just north of Dorotha, were advanced prior to even the feasibility study being completed because we had opportunity. We had funding opportunity, we had the political will, we had neighborhood support, and in particular at Killip, we had FUSD support. They're building a new elementary school. We saw 2 giant play fields and thought, storage. This might be our only opportunity in the wash to create storage. So we created a partnership with FUSD. That project's being delivered, will be done before July of 22. And as Mr. Clifton said, fairly successful from our viewpoint. And we hope it will mitigate much better south of 6th Avenue. But we also know there's a ton of work throughout the entire Spruce Wash. So the shortfall of the entire improvement, if you were to look at the feasibility study, is fairly significant. And we've also recognized we may not be able to capture the entire storm event. So in this case, we've modeled to what we think is a fairly reasonable storm of 700 or 800 CFS per minute, which is about 300 or 400 feet per second less than what we saw on August 17th. But the actual room for the infrastructure is pretty limiting. So we're challenged from the engineering perspective. And now what we're recommending, and we're going to likely continue to advocate for from not only water services but public works perspective, is we'd like to continue a series of improvements. We know Killip will be a huge, tremendous asset. We know the Dorotha Crossing will be improved, but we've got a lot of work to do at Cedar. We've got a lot of work to do at Linda Vista. We've got a joint project with the Flood Control District that is underway north of Paradise and right behind Paradise at Parkway. We've got a culmination of all these projects from really Killip to the top of Paradise, and we're in about the $26 to $30 million range. And I tell you, I wish I could walk up here and lay out a set of prints and say, here's exactly what it's going to look like. Here's exactly what we're going to build. Here's exactly what we're going to deliver. We're 3 months into the final feasibility study, and we are now starting to move towards the conversation of what can we physically build and deliver for our community. These projects are likely going to deliver the impact that we expect them to deliver, but we are falling short of the entire system. So the feasibility looked entire system. Price tag got pretty outrageous fairly quickly based on construction costs and just current trends. So now we're focusing our efforts between what we think is the most vulnerable part of the neighborhood, which is between Killip and the top of Paradise, for the most impact. So the request of that $26 to $30 million being prioritized really is what the engineers are signaling is might be our best opportunity to provide as much relief as possible. But with that caveat, that little asterisk, that it truly doesn't solve the entire problem, but it does a whole lot of good for a whole lot of people in a really ravaged area of the community, which we can kind of anticipate for likely 8 to 10 years, depending on what happens on the forest. With that, Ed, of course, has got technical questions. I'm happy to answer others, and I know Councilmember White's been very patient.
Yep. So did anyone calculate a total cost for that 8 weeks of cleanup and the impact on the individual homes that were affected?
Yeah, so Stacy PK is our resident expert on those, but we're generally in about the $3 million range.
Okay.
And some of that is some property loss, but it's a public property. The private parcels are more individualized and it's more proprietary information, but public infrastructure, the loss of Linda Vista, which is on a little different wash, but the loss of 4th Street, just sheer cleanup, $500,000 of landfill fees to move debris, which thankfully we found some other financial resources to cover. But the true infrastructure pieces are the ones we're talking about today, but the actual cost, I think we're gonna be about $3 million a season if we see something similar to what we saw last year.
So we could basically say an 8-year payback. If we got one of those floods per year.
I don't want to be dishonest because it's a little bit of a nebulous question, right? I mean, it may rain one year, it may not the next.
I understand that.
So I will also say the on-forest measures, the county measures are sediment capturing, they are alluvial fans. I mean, a lot of these efforts should hopefully start to contribute to a positive outcome of less debris in these areas, but we have also had pretty good intelligence coming back from all of our other partners on the burn. We saw about 20% of the capacity of the sediment from the mountain come down the mountain last year, which tells us there's still about 80% potential on the mountain. Doesn't mean it's going to come here,
right,
but there's still a lot of debris that may come into the community if we have a large event.
Is there an impact of the stormwater on wastewater? Are they two separate systems?
Yeah, they're separate. I mean, we do have some I&I, so that's infiltration and basically you have leak through in sections. A lot of sewer, a lot of wastewater, so it does go through our channels, but it's pretty minimal. I mean, there'll be a quick spike at Wildcat, and then that comes back down. But there is an impact in the short term, you know, on a day basis.
And this wash goes to South 4th Street, kind of down behind Fox Glen Park, winds up in the Rio. So it stays in a stormwater capacity versus going into the wastewater treatment site.
Yeah, that was like,
Gotcha.
I don't know if it impacted. Thanks.
Quickly, the Director Bertelson just walked in. If we have any other real director level questions, runs our water services division. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Ed. We actually have a couple of different things going on tonight. Our water commission is meeting right now, and Jim Huckel is giving a presentation to them on wastewater. So I have that going right here. I'm gonna turn that down a little bit. But thanks, Scott and Ed, for being here. And I guess we're talking about the stormwater needs for our community. And sorry, Mr. White, I missed the question.
We stopped up the overall, and now we're just into questions.
So anyway, we're fortunate to be able, Scott's working currently as a public works director. I'm in water services, and Ed's our stormwater manager. And we've been involved in the post-fire flood response from day one. And, you know, we had the monsoons the last 2 years. Fortunately, it rained last summer. Unfortunately, it rained more than what we wanted it to, in a spot where we didn't want it to rain so much. But we just continue to focus on the effort of protecting our community. We really do believe that we protected properties and even in some cases lives. My experience goes back to the Schultz flooding, and there was a day that I'll never forget with that Schultz fire and then the flooding that occurred afterwards. So we took that experience and we applied it here. But these wildfires are devastating. Our community is going through one right now. And then the post-wildfire rate events that occur are also devastating.
I'm sorry. Another question that dawns on me now as we're talking. Is there more area of forest that could be impacted by fire that would contribute additional flood waters to this particular area?
Ed can speak to that well. I mean, we had a day, was that August 17th of last year?
Yeah.
August of last year. Not only are we responding, we have a significant flood event as a result of the museum fire in the Spruce Avenue wash, but we also responded to the Rio de Flag. It was concerning, damaged a couple of homes just above city limits, then into Cheshire, as we followed that through the system. Also in the southwest part of our community, University Heights. And so we were, I always liken it to the Dutch child trying to stick their fingers in the dike, and at some point we were stretched for. There were a lot of holes in the dike, and we were stretched.
Chevy Chase in the Hoover Dam.
Yeah.
Gone.
Yeah.
Here's one.
Yeah.
Up over here.
Yeah. That said, we responded the best we could, and you have to applaud our first responders with that. Fire, police, public works, and water services are all part of that group, that first response group, and
So those particular burn areas would contribute to this particular.
So,
No,
No.
those are separate.
yeah.
So, yeah, that's my question.
yeah, I just wanted to come back. So of the Spruce Avenue wash, it was a percentage that was burned, and was it?
There's still about 60% that can burn.
So 40% burnt, 2,000 acres. It was a pretty small burn.
Yeah.
One we're seeing east counts 20,000.
Oh, no.
So fairly small burn, but the burn, the museum burn, was over the, only in the Spruce Wash. So that the events that Andy spoke to are the ones we still responded to, but not as a direct relationship to the post-wildfire.
But there still is potential.
Could be.
For more fire up there. Now, access is a lot more limited, yes.
Yeah, I guess it's probably a more appropriate question for the Forest Service or for our friends in fire, fuel management. They still have trails. It's open to public. It's got a Forest Service road. It's Forest Service jurisdiction. But clearly, yeah, there's unburned forest in the Spruce Wash that was not compromised. And then the other is the burn severity. So where we saw real damaging flows and a lot of debris was in the most severe burned areas. And there's other areas that weren't burned as severely. We're not seeing as much from those areas, but.
So that was only 700 acres. So we only had 700 acres of moderate and severe burn. So pretty small compared to other fires in the Southwest, but there's steep slopes right next to the.
The season kicked off early this year.
So,
A good question.
is there any other questions about the committee members? Mr. Dominguez?
Yeah, you mentioned Paradise is the north border, correct?
Of city limits,
Of
correct.
city limits. What other agencies, or what are they doing further up to prevent us from being the take-all? Is there something, mitigation by the Forest Service? I mean, what are they doing to prevent us from being flooded?
Excellent question.
So we were able to get the forest chief to come for a visit, and during that visit awarded the community $1.5 million for a watershed restoration in that burn area. Coconino County Flood Control District is managing that project, and essentially what happens is you get the burns, and then the flood waters, as it rains on them, the soil's hydrophobic, and it incisors the channels. When it incisors the channels, the water gets swifter, harder, faster. So to do some work to be able to lay out those really significant channels, to kind of create more of a fan approach to it, slow that water down, let it meander a bit. So the Flood Control District is managing that. Also, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is also part of the United States Department of Agriculture, awarded $1.8 million. There's a project that we're working on it's a city project with that to create some what we call sediment basins, because with that discharge, the sediment load is pretty significant, and then that increases the water and the damage that it can do. And then there's an area of the county called Mount Elton Estates, but it's essentially off of Elton Lookout Road. And there's some areas that in there that the Coconino County Flood Control District are utilizing those Natural Resources Conservation Fund dollars to lay out that channel. And hopefully that will serve to attenuate some of the flows prior to entering city limits.
It's a great question. I think just to add one point, I think the difficulty we're having, we're very supportive of their projects and thankful for their efforts, because frankly, they're moving at a very fast pace, as we are on a couple of projects, and it's been a good collaborative effort. We meet with them jointly weekly. The difficulty is the amount of room between the actual burn and the community of Flagstaff is so small and so short, there's just not much opportunity. So we've clearly advocated for as much on forest and as much prior to it even entering a community, county or city, but we don't have the land mass or the distance to try to build some of these larger projects that they had success with, for example, in Schultz. So
That's
very,
a-
very different
And
terrain.
that's a good informative point, because people are gonna say, why is the city of Flagstaff paying for all this when it's coming off the Forest Service?
That's right.
So it's something that I think needs to be pushed, expanded, so people know. You know, you should say turn off the
Right.
faucet or turn on the faucet. So it's good to know that there's no space
Right.
to fix it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Guerra?
Yeah, along those lines, would we be needing all this money if it weren't for the museum fire? And if I recall, wasn't the museum fire man-made and wasn't there a liability assessed to this fire? And why aren't they paying for the cost of making sure that we're not flooded out in the future?
The pre-fire flows were certainly not as significant as these post-fire flows. So I think that answers your first question. I think getting the forest supervisor to come, the chief of the National Forest to come and award those initial funds for the restoration was a good faith effort to show that there's a partnership for responsibility. As those flows enter the city of Flagstaff system and our infrastructure, the infrastructure that has been in place that we're utilizing to manage these flows provided sufficient flow. It managed the flows that we got prior to that fire, but they don't manage the flows as a result of the fire.
You mind if I add to that? I think the modeling is bearing this out too, though. The storms are more intense and perhaps more frequent, and even outside of the museum scar last summer, we had an event up on Mount Eldon. And that was a 250 year.
About that, yeah.
And that flooded, unfortunately, a couple of houses in my neighborhood. And, so I think the burn is a big part of the discussion. I think there's also a question mark about what lies ahead in terms of the severity of these monsoonal storms.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Moore?
Just a quick question about the feasibility study. Did it uncover any issues that could come up with, like property acquisition or anything like that? Or are you going to be able to utilize what's already in place? Or
So it's still only 3 months old. And they've moved very quickly and they've done fantastic work, our private engineering community that's done this project. It did identify majority of the project to stay within right-of-way and within what we have of existing infrastructure to its maximum capacity. Unfortunately, when you weave this wash through the most urban dense neighborhood of this wash, we just don't have a lot of room. They are undergoing right now kind of an alternative analysis. Are there other things we could do? Could we take water down west or down 4th Street? Could we move it in other places? We've kind of developed those through the engineering discussions. A lot of those are probably not going to come to fruition because they'll be really expensive. But we did not get to the place where we said, let's just take a lot of property or build a large channel. Because simply, frankly, we knew we'd get real expensive real quickly if we moved outside of really what we could have access to. But it certainly has impacts on each resident and each neighbor and each street. Because the infrastructure to carry 10 times the original flow, if not as much as possible, may look very, very different. And that's difficult for some residents.
so I guess the point of my question too, do you foresee any issues, like if you got funding, is there a bottleneck anywhere where like if we don't have an easement recorded on this couple of parcels or anything like that, that it sort of gums up the works? Or
Possibly. I think we need more education, that we want more time to investigate it. I think we know that the best opportunity we have is between Killip and Paradise. And I'll tell you, we've had a lot of challenges in the last 6 months, and we try to find a way to get to a solution. And we've pushed the engineering community pretty hard, and they're pretty creative. And I think for our residents, as we advocate for this neighborhood, we're pushing hard because even though it might be an obstacle, we can find a way to solve that problem too. And so far, we're having pretty good success, but it's communicating, it's trying to be very, very honest about things. And you're spot on. We're gonna run into some things that maybe we didn't anticipate. Oh man, There's a water main we gotta relocate through here. And we've kind of thought about a lot of those things, but as a design were to get further, and I wish I had the design completed today, because I think it's an easier ask of the voters. But we need to communicate that as we go to this design effort, we're gonna understand those better, and we're hopefully before November, having a real good conversation about some of those things that maybe are more obstacles than we thought. But we've gotten lucky on a few too.
And I will say, since we're staying within the footprint of the existing stormwater infrastructure, feasibility study, there's no huge red flag. There's no like, oh, we have to go straight through whatever business or house. I mean, it's gonna be water main relocates or a little easement here or there.
A roadway
Yeah,
crossing.
roadway crossing. For the portion that we're asking funding for down in Killip, I don't think there's anything that comes out as a huge, oh my gosh, we have to really look at this hard. I mean, we are within the footprint that we're using right now as a stormwater conveyance.
Mr. McLaughlin?
I thought I heard you mention that after a fire, there's a timeline of impact where it's the greatest of impact. Was that 5 to 8 years? Was that?
Well, you don't know this,
You want me to
Michelle,
jump on?
fires, I mean, they jump on,
Yeah.
tough one.
You hate to always answer a question with it depends, but depends on the recovery of the forest. It depends on how much of the debris has been discharged to date. And then that forest recovery. And I think that's part of the work that's being done on forest right now is to accelerate that recovery. And I know in our experience with the Schultz projects, I think, so the fire was in 2010, it's now 2022. Certainly there was another fire just in that area that they're fighting right now. But in terms of the watershed, we accelerated by some of the work that we were able to do on forest and then through the community. We accelerated some of those processes. And so, of recovery. Now, the hydrologists, geologists, and all of the geologists that study the post-fire flooding impacts, if we were to do nothing approach, could take 8 to 10 years or 10 to 20 years. We just don't know, but it's a long timeline. And what we do know is in that timeline, we currently have how many thousand sandbags out in the community?
700.
700,000. And that's a really tough way to live under that threat consistently. So anything that we can do, and the response is how much per year? Yeah, and so those response numbers start to add up to where we can do a project that would prevent the level of response necessary. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but it takes.
I'd be very hesitant putting even a range of years to the recovery. The preliminary results from some of the scientists, biologists. It's a very slow recovery. And part of that's climate change, part of that's the south facing slope. Some of that's the monsoon, 2020 had a huge mortality up there. So I would be very hesitant putting a range of years. It's going to be a long slog, let's put it that way.
And Devon, I think a really good way that I kind of justify it, because I think it's a really good question. And I think, why would we make a $30 million investment if in 10 years, maybe it's not as needed?
Or it takes us 5 years to build it, and now we're at the end of our impact rate. So that was gonna be my follow-up
I
question.
think what I remember is, and this is really important, is the existing infrastructure that's going to be designed to fit in this right of way, as maximum as we can get it, can only capture an X portion of the storm. We know we're gonna have some bigger events, and we're not gonna be able to get to a place where we're really, really comfortable to say, we've built some infrastructure so big that it can handle it. So all that forest recovery, that helps us with the calculations of, great, the forest recovered, the infrastructure is bigger, but not as big as we'd like it to be. But maybe if it all kind of lines up, it really works well. And that's a little bit of a hope, but at the same time, I think encouraging to think that is a benefit to the entire system. Less debris, less water, less property damage. But I think we have to be really careful about understanding a recovery is totally unknown and totally up to so many different factors that really no one can tell you with certainty in 10 years you will no longer have these flows. And The radio fire from 1976 still looks the exact same.
Right. I thought about that.
So I really am struggling with waiting on recovery. And I think that's why we're all saying that's probably not the best strategy.
So then for voters though, in November, if they vote this in, $26, $30 million, whatever it is, what is the timeline for implementation? Because next year it's not going to be done. And so there is a greater risk of flooding. Is it the year after? Is it 5 years, 10 years?
Devon, I'm already ahead of you.
Okay.
But, no, it's a really, really good question because we've not been asked yet of how you deliver these quickly. I think we're a little bit ahead of it. I think by your consideration and the council's consideration, we've got to get a few of those things done first. I think when we're asked in the next few weeks, what would the timeline look like? I think we'll back it up from an election. We'll back it up and say, okay, in the event that the voters were to approve, we then go to study work. Can we advance some of that study work that maybe would make sense, that would be utilized whether we have bond funding or not? If we could advance some of that, that might give us a jump start to next spring. But yeah, by the time you have the voter approval, ratification of vote, bond issuance, next spring's gonna be here before we know it. And true delivery of $30 million of projects, probably 3 years. So we'd have to phase it. I wanna ask the engineers, what's your highest priority? Where can we do the best amount of work as quickly as possible that makes sense? How do we model that? Killip schools, we did it this season because we had an opportunity. So sometimes when the funding lines up, it makes those opportunities move a little more quickly because that's one piece of the puzzle we haven't had to worry about as much. But I'd look forward to starting to figure out how would we time that and how do we tell voters when it would be delivered if successful. And if it's not successful, we still have to answer the problem.
Mhm.
Sorry, you mentioned like roughly 3 million in the cost of the cleanup from these two events. Is there any estimates on the cost to the private sector, like private property damage? And because obviously that's probably going to be significantly more too that we need to take into account as a community, I would think.
We do have damage assessments. I wish those numbers were coming to me. They're not right now, but they're significant, both to the businesses and then the homeowner. I don't recall that number.
And again, it's housed in our kind of recovery section, and that's really not what we're closely tracking. We can get you that data. I think what's also kind of important to remember, we have short-term measures in place that were placed in 2019, 700,000 sandbags and 600 lineal feet of barrier. We prevented a lot of property damage as a community, and that's a win. It did what it was supposed to do. So had we done nothing in 2010 or 2020, I think you would have seen literally catastrophic damage through that entire region. So that's not always our go-to number, but I think we need to formulate and clearly get really good, accurate information for the public to understand if we were to go with a question to the voters. And that's why it's vetted here, and we'll start vetting all of those questions, but really good question.
There's some costs that aren't quantified. I mean,
Yeah, the
quality of life,
Yeah.
if you live there, opportunity costs, I mean, the entirety of public works, its whole section or division, and most water services were out there for 2 months straight. So that means there's 2 months of work that's not being done in other parts.
And the community was closed from West to 4th Street. The school was flooded, and so
Yeah,
just
but demo was advanced a year.
Yeah, definitely. I will say, to answer Devon's question, I think too on the timeline, so just, I hate to sound like an expert with the Schultz talk, but it is an experience that I can recall, and the fire was in 2010. I came to the city of Flagstaff in 2016. And I think we're accelerated on projects with this Spruce Avenue wash with the Killip detention basin, just because we have that experience, we know the severity, and we know the criticalness of the timeline. But in 2016, we were still implementing projects, and we were in constant response from 2010 through that time until we were able to get some projects implemented. And until those projects were able to be implemented, the response didn't change. It was just as severe in 2015. We had some significant events as we had in 2010. Once we started to implement those projects, then that started to change the necessity of the response in those specific areas. So.
Yeah, the residents that are affected by this, I'm sure FEMA's involved, right? Are they in the flood zone? Do they have to buy flood insurance? I mean, what's the impact on them? Are we gonna help them be able to get insurance for their homes? I mean,
It's a great question.
I think that one lady that's sitting on the corner with the barricades all around her house, I feel for her. I mean, she can't sell it, what can she do? Is this gonna help the residents?
Well, this project definitely will help. I mean, as Scott was saying, this won't help for every
I'm getting
storm
back
out
to
there.
the FEMA question.
Yeah, go back to FEMA. We'll answer the first ones first and get to the last. So FEMA is, I think people have a little bit of a misunderstanding of what FEMA does at the community level. So FEMA really delegates out their authority to the local administrators. So in this case, it's my section, so stormwater section. And what they look at, starting in the 1960s, is what's called the floodplain, special flood hazard area. And that's something that they map at the national level based on a design storm. So a hypothetical storm that you would see a 1% chance of seeing every year. So it's also called a 100-year storm. 100-year storm, Spruce Wash, was 200 CFS because before the fire. So our stormwater system, pre-fire, could take that design storm. There was no floodplain through this Grandview, Sunnyside area. I mean, there was, but right at the channel limits, it really did not branch out into the homes themselves. Now, you have to remember FEMA is a federal agency, so when they see a fire, they're saying, okay, you need to figure out how you're going to change any mapping or whatnot. To remap one neighborhood costs about $100,000 to $200,000 and takes about a year and a half. So we consciously have not remapped that neighborhood because we don't see the benefit of doing so, because we're going to be remapping it continuously as the watershed changes and as we put in mitigation. So it's just not in the taxpayer's interest to be remapping this. We're not getting the benefit out of it. If you're in a floodplain, that doesn't guarantee you're getting any benefit from FEMA. They don't pay out to you. You can buy flood insurance regardless of the match floodplain. So, and that's the same flood insurance because it's federally subsidized and it's federally regulated. So it doesn't matter if you're getting it through Geico or Travelers or whatever else, it's the same insurance. It's not actually that private insurer's insurance claim through FEMA. So there is no benefit to remapping the floodplain from our side because we're not adding any protection to the existing homeowners. Really what the FEMA floodplain is there for is to try to get people out of a long-term floodplain. So let's say like the Mississippi River or whatnot, make sure that they eventually move out of there so that they aren't hit by repetitive floods. For something like this, where you have a post-fire event, we want to wait and see what mitigations we can put in, see how the forest recovers, and then we will remap it for future folks that are coming into the neighborhood so that they have those protections and understand what they're coming into. Before we do that, we will do what's called an administrative floodplain. So that is a local floodplain ordinance that will be done at the city level. But again, that's not going to provide any extra protections for someone who's already living there. It won't provide any extra funding for anybody who's living there. The only time FEMA will pay out for an individual is when you hit an individual cap, which if I remember right from Stacy, I'm going on a ledge here, it's about $10 million.
Right. So Jesse, to answer your question, because you brought up an individual homeowner, so how does it impact an individual homeowner? FEMA, through their designee, Arizona Department of Emergency Management, will come in and they'll conduct damage assessments or individual assessments. And what Ed is referring to, there's a dollar threshold. So the damage, and it's a very high dollar threshold, I don't recall the number. So the damage has to exceed that in order for individual assistance to kick in. Individual assistance is exactly just that. It would benefit the individual homeowner for those damages. That number hasn't kicked in. And so it's kind of a catch-22 where when these assessments are taking place, we don't want to see all that damage and we're hoping it's not as severe, but at the same time, you're hopeful it will meet that dollar threshold so individuals can benefit. In this case, it didn't.
If you ask why that threshold is so high, you have to remember FEMA works with Hurricane Katrina, Rita. They're working in communities that have had thousands of homes destroyed. So from their lens, their perspective, even though this is a disaster at a local level, it's not, they see it different.
I guess my question was, how can we say this is going to be good for the residents? How can we get rid of the sandbags? how can we, is this going to be the, and you said no, the fit all? Yeah, we know that, but is it going to help the quality of life of the residents that are living there now? We need to sell it. So if we say, oh, well, FEMA doesn't care, blah, 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 it isn't gonna sell. So this is where I'm coming from is, I want our neighbors to be taken care of. And to go back to some kind of a normal life. Is this gonna work?
It will reduce the flood risk, so you'll have a lower risk of having either a flood or a flood of a certain level. So let's say you saw 3 feet of water in one flood, it will likely reduce that amount that you're gonna see. We can't tell you exactly how much, because until it's put in, we don't have, that whole model, but it will help. Maybe you won't get rid of sandbags, but maybe instead of having a sandbag wall that's looks crazy, maybe it'll be way smaller.
And Jesse, post-fire 100-year flood event, CFS, I don't know.
3,000.
3,000. I know we got about 1,200 cubic feet per second through that Linda Vista channel. I think what we found when we were implementing projects in Schultz, we knew we couldn't design and build to the 100-year flood. It wasn't physically, it wasn't technically possible, wasn't financially possible. And how much of that risk are you really reducing? I think, so we picked a design storm, 5-year, 25-year, and built to that. And I think what we found is it wouldn't manage to the most significant event. To Greg's point, this is a really good one. We had a 200-year event off the Mount Elton watershed. So there's still a risk with that level of event, but in a monsoonal rain event, that's a 5-year storm event, 10-year, even 20-year, it's going to help manage those flows.
Certainly lessens the pain.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I not see anything from Mr. Washington.
Just one real quick one. Do you have new financial information to offer us today that will impact any of these amounts?
So, Al, you were in our budget hearing, and you heard, and you came in for that grant discussion. And so, to the point about working with our partner agencies, whether it's Forest Service, Natural Resources Conservation Service, we're putting it all out there. Any funding that's available, we're trying to obtain that funding. In terms of,
I think we're still in the 26 to 30 million range, and that doesn't do the entire watershed.
Okay.
That only catches the most vulnerable spots that we've identified between Killip and Paradise. So 30 million is, I think, probably a hard down request, but it's going to be reasonable. It does meaningful work. And as Andy said, we'll go to bat to leverage it with every federal resource, with every grant we can find, with every opportunity or redevelopment opportunity we can find. Because I think we can spend a lot of money in this corridor for a long time, but this is pretty significant. It's pretty meaningful, in particular, the most hardest, most dense hit area of that community. But some of the stuff maybe further downstream that's not as damaging, like at Route 66, some impacts, but doesn't quite do the same level of damage that it's doing in different parts of this neighborhood.
Thank you.
I do have one question is concerning if this does get approved by the voters in November, I'm sure the city will have maintenance costs, ongoing maintenance costs to take care of the system so it doesn't, overgrow with weeds or whatever happens.
I might have to, before Ed jumps on that one, because I know he wants to badly. But an undersized but well-maintained storm drain system is better than nothing at all. And so we're really working on building capacity. We were able to get a grant, I think, Al, you probably heard that, through DFFM, which is
Department of Forest and Fuel, or Forest Management.
for what we call a combo truck, a back truck, to help clean out those culverts. And we really need to make an effort to have a planned and targeted maintenance, channel maintenance system in our stormwater section. So.
And stormwater is a pretty new group. I mean, this is the last 7 or 8 years as being a utility. So they're growing. They're all the resources are going over here to the Spruce Wash. But community-wide, lots of needs. Rio de Flag, washes all over the community. So it's a growing program through their stormwater.
Mount Eldon, we all saw the Prius on
That's
national
right.
news.
That's right.
Yeah, we will be doing it won't be done in time for election season, but there will be a stormwater rate assessment. So there will be a study to see if the stormwater utility rate is adequate for the maintenance of all the work that's gonna be going on.
And we're doing that in water services in general. So, becoming more of a team between water, wastewater, stormwater, and we know we're not supposed to mix all of them, but the people working in those areas. So for example, our wastewater folks are helping out clean storm drains and just trying to get the people where they're needed the most. And just like any emergency, sometimes it's an all hands on deck.
All right, okay, thank you.
Yeah, excellent questions. Thank you. We appreciate the time.
You're welcome.
All right, good luck, everyone.
So with that, it leads to our next agenda item is discuss among ourselves a recommendation. I was wondering if our partners that the city has hired to work with this committee has any opening thoughts concerning this next item so we can move forward in our process.
Thank you, Chair. Let's hear from the consultants. I don't know if we have Steve with us, Mary, but you can share with us what you would like to start this discussion.
Sure thing. Yeah, sorry Steve isn't with us. He I think everybody may know he had some surgery today, so he wasn't, I don't think we want him with us at the moment, to be honest. First of all, I just applaud you all. You've got a daunting task. I know that. And we will do everything we can to help you and support you. Our thinking is you can come at this two different ways. And I think Committee Member White, you suggested we can either start at the bottom on a list and eliminate the things we know we don't want, or we can start at the top and say, what is it that we absolutely can't live without? And I would suggest one of those. That would be your preference. What we can do to support you, and Meredith can share her screen, we have the list of the potential bond measures with the information on it and the project costs, some of which is, of course, it ranges, not just a single dollar amount. And what we can do to help is keep a running total for you. So if you do start at the what projects are we going to eliminate, we can keep a running tab for you. And if you start with what projects do we absolutely have to keep to start out with, we can run it that way. I'm hoping that will be helpful. I don't know. I mean, some groups we've worked with vote. Some groups go around the group and say, what's the most important project to you? You know, personally, that you see as the most important to the city of Flagstaff. That might be a good way to get the dialogue started.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Could you bring up the one sheet that was, Steve had kind of make a recommendation. You know, it was kind of the middle of the road of all the different priorities that was given from the committee members' response and also the community members' response. And I think in the committee member, response, there was a suggestion by Steve, you know, kind of a cutoff, you know, as Mr. White has suggested, of working from the bottom up. And, you know, I was wondering if that list could come up on that screen for us, just for discussion, and then do kind of a round robin with the committee members and see if there was anything that was below that suggestion by Steve. If there was committee members say no, that I'm missing from that bottom half, that I would like to see percolate back up to the top. Is that a fair assessment from the committee members of one way of starting the discussion and kind of narrowing and get us focused?
It's a great suggestion for a way to start. Although I would say at this point in time, it sounds like Tuesday, the city council is going to weigh in and eliminate some things. So maybe starting from the top down might be more. In other words, we go around and what is it that you absolutely think you really want to fall on the sword for? And let them eliminate the bottom. When we come back next time, we'll know what projects are gone. But I mean, it's the same process, it's just would be in reverse.
Okay, Ms. Jefferson?
Dara Martino.
Oh, Dara,
Listen,
sorry.
I wanted to throw out one other thought before we jump into the specific projects. And so on the last presentation, this is a printout of slide 20. I don't know if you guys can see that, maybe bring it up so that, but it's basically just it was the which is the most important to you. And there was this really, really super clear dominance in the housing category compared to all the others. But then that's not really reflected in my mind in the, when we start looking at specific projects. The first housing one jumps in at number 5. And you know, there's a significant amount of money up ahead of it. And I just want to see if we can have a discussion about that discrepancy before we start talking about projects. Because to me, that's a really big issue. If our top 4 projects, at least by the public's impressions, do not align with what the public said was the most important, like I'm just a little confused about that, and would love to just talk more about that.
Meredith, you had your hand up.
It
I'm
was,
sorry.
hi, sorry, I wanted to, in response to your question, Chair, about the line, I just want to make sure that everyone understands that that was an arbitrary line that we selected strictly from the results of the survey from you all. And even at that line, it was above the 70 million. So I'm happy to show that number, or I'm happy to pull up a more comprehensive view of what the community survey said, what our city staff has indicated, and kind of draw that line for you there. I will take whatever direction you'd like me to. I just wanted to be real explicit that that line that we drew was just a number that we picked. And if that's something for you helpful to start with, I'm happy to go that route. If there's a different number you'd like to start with, I can certainly do that as well.
Well, before we do that, Meredith, I'd like to get to the committee member, Ms. Morano. Doing that, why was there discrepancy versus the committee identified need versus what the community had identified?
And this actually is not a difference between the committee and the community. This is a difference between the community and the community. So this is the community's responses saying housing.
And
43.7% said that was the most important issue. But then when you get down to the projects, and the first housing project is at number 5. Those are all from the community. So I'm curious how we can have our top 4 community priority projects be so dramatically different than what the community said is the most important measure being housing.
Are you talking about the way we had them in the rank order?
I'm sorry, say that again?
is that the one?
Yeah, that's this one I have, yeah.
So Mary, you're at the right screen that Ms. Morano brought up. And so I guess have you repeat the question for Mary, and maybe Mary can help us answer.
Sure, and I mean, it's not really, I'm not really necessarily looking for an explanation about why those 2 are so different, but I think we should be talking about the fact that they are, and really trying to, you know, like, for example, if we were to sort of go with the idea of, okay, you know, these are the top 4 measures already bring us, you know, into like the, what is that, like the $60,000, close to $60 million range. And we haven't even gotten to housing yet, but the community says that housing is the most important issue. But like, I just think it's something that we really need to look seriously at before we start picking projects.
Dara, I think that's really important. I noticed that last week. And so what I did in my own work is I started looking at each individual section and looking at what's the priority within that section. Therefore, we could get a good mix of, like in my little work here, I got 4 things in housing, with less things in some of the others based on what I was seeing. So I think that's a really important point, that we think about housing as, I mean, personally, I think housing should be way up there, right? Along with food wash, if I had to pick like top things. It doesn't mean all the funding goes to that in a way, but some, maybe a little bit more goes to those 2. Yeah, I was very struck by that. That's part of the survey.
Right, and it's hard, because, public has a perception, the needs, housing, no question. That's a huge topic among anyone you probably talk to on the street, or majority of residents talk on the street, because a lot of people are challenged, as we saw with 50% of income being put towards rents. I think it was that high, it was pretty high. And so housing is an issue for the community. Vice Chair, go ahead.
I'm just gonna venture a possible explanation. And it's not worth the paper, it's not written on, but here's the way I would interpret that. Those findings that you've identified. And it comes down to a vagueness versus a specificity issue. And vaguely, the community knows that a number one problem in many sectors and areas has been identified as the inability to live here and live here and make a living, spend your money, and then be able to contribute to the rest of society, because everything you make goes to rent. And then there's the list of projects in this specific, and they identify particular needs within those segments. And so I think, and this is just a guess, that in a vague sense, if the community were, and we are a good community and we're representative, and we're here in the room, that those things, I think the same identified categories would emerge, just because they are for specific solutions to what otherwise are very, very vague and ambiguous areas.
And if I may just add that the slide 20 that I apologize, I don't know who it is, but brought that up, but that was at the beginning of the survey. So that was prior to more detailed information being shared about not only the individual areas of focus, but the projects within each of the categories. So I just share that as a point of information for you as you continue to deliberate.
Thank you.
The other thing is, we asked them initially, is public safety very important? Some people honestly said very important on all of them, or very important on 3/4 of them. Then we said, which is most important to you? So that may be why there seemed to be a disparity, if that makes sense. Then we went further on into the survey and went into greater detail on each of those, and then said within that category, housing, whatever the category was, which is important to you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, good information, thank you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I guess one thing I would point out is that the average citizen probably spent about 10 minutes doing this. We've spent about 20 or 30 hours. So I think mostly we should look at this. If the citizens say, this isn't important to me, we're going to have a hard sell, and maybe we should drop the things that have very low scores. And as long as the citizens call it somewhat important or important, it's in play. And then we should use our all the information we've gained and reflected upon to do those priorities. So the worst things, drop them off, everything else that's in play, and ignore the numbers.
But you're saying don't get too hung up on the specific.
Right, unless they say this is not important, don't try to sell me this. Well, then, maybe we should pay attention to that.
Okay,
Mr. Moore.
I think part of what you're seeing too, when I'm reading through the rank order of importance over across all of them, is that housing is an incredibly complex issue that has all of these little moving pieces. Whereas when you look at the number one, it's pretty cut and dry. It's like improve the flood and spruce wash. And it's a $26 million ask. Just that's more easy to digest. Like, yes, we know we need that. Whereas housing, it needs lots of little gives. So I think that sort of dilutes the importance when they're trying to figure out what they should ask for, what they should like, because the average person, I think, doesn't understand when you say housing, like Al said. It's very complex. It's from homelessness to home ownership and everything in between it. A lot of moving parts to actually have a good effect.
That's what I meant to say.
Thank you. Again, try to kind of move forward and kind of funnel us to that list of priorities, and not get too hung up. Again, I do like one's earlier suggestion of working from top down up. I know this council might do that for us, but maybe after they hear from us, it's like, oh, it'll make it even easier for the council.
Yeah, and there's two of you that brought that up, so.
Yeah.
But I also agree with asking Mary to keep score. So as we go around, if she writes our name down and says, no wait for this one. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Instead of operating in a vacuum, is it possible to overlay our results with the community results to see where there are real discrepancies? For example, if we agree with the community, it can make it a lot easier for us to move forward. And if we disagree, and if the community agrees that we don't need certain things and we all agree, this isn't the top down or bottom up necessarily, it's just an overlay to see where everybody lays relative to one another.
I want to add something to that too, and this is exactly why I asked for the rankings last time, I said rankings, the priorities that the staff members had put forth. So, and I appreciate that you all did that, you did send out a spreadsheet on it, but what I was really wanting to see also is how do those rankings compare to like the project list? So, like having all that information, like what do the staff members from the departments think is important compared to what does the community think is the most important and this committee think is most important, and like seeing that kind of all together. I tried to sort of shorthand it myself a little bit with the information that was sent this week, and for the most part, there's a lot of agreement between what the staff members and the community saw was most important, but it would also be really nice to see what us as a committee, like how that lays in there too.
Yeah, I did that myself, because that's where I went. So if we could get something that was city put together, I think it would be really helpful for people to see. There's a lot of overlap. I mean, I was able to.
There's a lot, but not 100%. Like,
Not
there's definitely
100%.
some that are put.
Right, and then some of the things that we thought were important and the community thought was important were lower ranked by the city.
Yeah.
So those are things that we should talk about.
Yeah.
So I think it would help narrow our scope a little bit if we could see all of it together. Because I found it useful.
Right, sure.
How does the group feel about taking these projects by stormwater and wastewater infrastructure projects, one category, go around, public safety infrastructure projects, another thing? In other words, I had 4 sheets, they were pages on the presentation. I don't have the page numbers on here, but stormwater, public safety, housing projects, and energy efficient buildings and transportation projects. And starting, I mean, it's a way to start cutting the cake, I guess.
It'd be a good suggestion. I do want to keep in mind what Mr. Byer said, that if whatever reason we chose something, and it was the last thing on the community's interest, it'll be a tough sell. And so that's why I think we need to clean up our list a little bit and then go from there. And that's why, I suggested, they're kind of an arbitrary cutoff. Because as Mr. Byer said, and it's well taken, that if the, especially the community one, like there, and the community is just not going to support anything, especially the last item on the community list. And it's not going anywhere. And council, I would assume, would not try to push something to try to ramrod something when the community has no interest in something. So,
But isn't that where we identify what the community may need education about? If we determine, because we've put in all this time, that it actually is a priority of the city, and they haven't put in the time, maybe they just need education.
I get, and there is, I saw one item that, for example, when I was going through the list, because I was kind of scoring my own between the two, what committee, commit, and community. I did not take into consideration concerning city staff, because I was a little worried. I want to try to align committee and community up the best we can. And, you know, like the community had identified public safety and structure vehicle radios, or committee had identified as number 20, but the community identified as number 4. And so, you know, how do we, you know, because obviously that arbitrary line, that item might just fall off, but we did like radios, we did hear about funding possibility. So that's an item that could come off, even though the community had identified that was very popular, an item that the community thought should be funding. And some of the committee things that we identified, the community wasn't too much interested. There wasn't a lot of that. It was pretty close, and a lot of what the community, other than the radios, that was way off for whatever reason. And so, me personally, that cutoff, personally, and be up again to the majority of us, just a way to move forward is using the arbitrary cutoff that the committee maybe has identified versus more of the community. But I don't know. Or do we just want to start with each one of us and this is my number 1 item that I want to see on as start, and then kind of tabulate that. I'll have our partners kind of keep a running score of dollar amounts. So I just kind of want to find a way for us to kind of move forward and, you know, get too quagmire, and 3 weeks later we're still sitting here.
Let's give our priorities. I think that's just, we all have opinions. Let's give our opinions.
Okay.
And then once we have our opinions, we can then say,
Your opinion's wrong.
let's cut the bottom and then see where.
How our individual priorities match up with the community and the committee as a whole, city staff, and how that.
There's 30 items.
What did we learn in the last 2 months?
There's 30 items, let's cut it off.
I guess my
16 to
concern
30,
is,
1 for 15.
my concern is that what I did is I did what Dara was talking about, where you have what the committee thought overall, and what the public thought overall, and then what the city thinks is the priority. I'm trying not to put my personal stuff into this. You know what I mean?
Right.
I do know what you mean.
So when I put my personal thought for my organization would be probably a little different. And there's definitely overlap. But, you know, when I added all this in myself manually, there's a lot of matching if you look at each individual section, like energy efficiency buildings, rather than lumping them all together and go 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we could meet the needs.
So,
You know, what we thought was important, but also what
So I think let's go back to Al's suggestion about going to each infrastructure, et cetera. We automatically know there's going to be kind of a lower score wanted by the committee and the community, and et cetera, that will kind of naturally fall off. And then if there's consensus among the committee to leave that one out there, and then at least we have a start. Does that sound fair? At least so we can at least get the ball rolling. And so Mary, you're gonna have to help us. There's each individual paper that has, and I think we all, I know, Michelle, you have that. And so we'll just start with one, and I'll let you pick, as it's totally random, and bring up that bullet point of infrastructure or stormwater, wastewater, public safety, whatever you want to choose. And let's just start going with it. Oh, Mary, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
That's never happened to any of us, has it? I'll let Meredith grab whatever she's got handy first. So we'll all be surprised.
See that?
So Meredith is gonna bring up one of the items, whether it's stormwater, public safety, whatever. Okay, all right. That sound good with what you'd like to see, or do you want to see a different page?
I'll have there.
I have public safety, these were,
Not that type of slide, the one that actually shows the rankings and stuff on it.
oh, what?
No,
Well,
no,
we got this guy,
This one does not have
Oh, it
rankings.
does.
right. This
The
guy
one that
is
she
the one-
does have rankings.
Yeah, and this is the sheet, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly how those rankings came, but I know they were delivered by Steve. That starts with, stormwater as 1967 points, public safety infrastructure.
There you go, that's better. That reads better.
Okay, that's the one, so that's this. Yes? Oh,
I have ranked on it.
These nice. Oh, yeah.
Is everybody comfortable with this, how we're starting off with? Okay. All right. So we got public safety, and we see the rankings. And the rankings was total points by who again, Mary or Meredith?
We assigned 5 points if somebody said very important and 3 points if they said somewhat important. So that, because otherwise if you just look at the very important, it doesn't give you, I think, as rich a data. And that's the way we like to do it, because that includes people who are think it's somewhat important could be persuaded to vote. And if we have to keep coming back to, this is an election and we have to get to 51 votes. So that's why we did it that way, so that it could be a little bit richer data for you to see overall level of support.
Okay. And these points was gathered from committee, community, everybody from the surveys, these points?
The community surveys, yes.
Everybody.
Just the community.
Not these ranked points do not reflect your committee's ranking. This is strictly the community.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be helpful if we had the community versus ours in column form, and maybe even
Yeah.
the city staff and where their priorities are, so we can
So
see this?
the public safety didn't come up in our group as
No,
in the
it was
top
very
10 at
low.
all.
No.
So when I was going through it, I didn't even put anything up there because it didn't overlap with anything. Also, 2 of them are potentially funded or potentially funded.
Okay, so
Sorry, I mean, we got 7 minutes.
right.
And,
So that's what
and
I was
I
gonna go
have
give
to
direction to
get
staff.
going, yeah. So I'm wondering if we could do like a fourth choice ranking exercise in the next week and get that data back by our conversation next week, so we can see, like, do we all pick the Spruce Wash flood project as number 1? Really just don't even have to talk about it anymore because there's consensus. And there's the bottom 15, and we all feel comfortable saying we're not that invested in them, or we're invested in 2 of them, and we want to talk more about that. And then we can have the conversation instead of going group by group, because I don't know if any public safety ranks above some of these other bigger ones for watershed initiatives. Or if they're already funded, quite frankly, through another source, and we don't have to talk about them. And so if there was a way to just collectively get our consensus without hashing out every line item, then we can start from that.
So what I do like, suggestion, what everybody seems like they would like to see is everything kind of grouped together.
Overlay.
And like an overlay, this was the community, the committee, and how did they kind of mesh to and among staff members?
That's what I'm hearing, Chair, and I'm wondering if we can quickly hear from either Mary and or Meredith as to the doability of that, which it sounds like it's quite doable, and when we might be able to receive it, then we can get it out to you guys right away, if that's a good direction. Mary, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I have Miss Anderson's hand up real quick.
We actually did that one Friday.
Oh, see how fast?
So I'm gonna bring up this next slide, and this, if you could just confirm this is where you want to add it, so we're
Thank you,
doing
Shane.
what you would like.
I'm sorry that I didn't recognize that.
No worries. So we've got the survey rank order, we've got the priority order from staff. So what you're asking is that we add another column that gives the committee.
Yes, but I do also have a question about this one. So in that priority order column, there's some that have like 1/3 or 5/6/10. What does that mean?
Shannon,
So-
can you enlarge, please?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
One moment. Better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so what that means is that we actually merged two of the items that staff presented to you. So their priority 1 and 3 is in this one item that was on the survey.
Okay, and then how come in the public safety section, how come they have 5 items but only 1, 2, and 3 for the ranking?
Because they only had 3 priorities. And the priorities were split up into multiple projects on the survey. So for instance, their number 1 priority was the communication. It included the radios and the tower. But we split it into 2 questions here, so that's why you see 2 number 1s.
So sometimes it was split and sometimes it was merged.
Yeah.
So I have a question about that, because as it's going to a potential bond measure, if we split it this way for the sake of the survey, but they're planning on presenting it as one item, that feels like it could have a major impact on both the voting that would happen and some confusion, because I had the same question when it came to the ones that had like 5, 7, 10 on it. I'm instantly looking at the 10 and thinking this isn't important. And yet one part of it is ranked 5, that just creates some confusion, I think.
I don't know how we address that at this point without doing another survey. Because we again tried to make the survey to where it wasn't too long. And so that's why some of these things were grouped together, is so that we could not create fatigue with people filling it out and then not doing or providing us with their feedback. I think the same is going to be true in the election. You know, I've heard Newpoint and others talk about voter fatigue and being careful about how many questions you ask. And so that would be one of the things that council will work through, is how many questions do we want to put on the survey.
Well, I think as a starting point, just simply getting the committees the committee as another column there so that we can cross-check that or just sort of crosswalk it, I guess, another time. I think that would be helpful for next week. And does that mean what you're saying, Devonna, too?
I think it's the first step, but then I'd also just like to do the ranked choice voting as an exercise and have that data come back. Like if we had to pick.
Yeah,
what we
among
were-
ourselves in our private.
Knowing all of this, right?
Yeah.
Knowing what the community said, knowing what the staff said, knowing what we've already kind of collectively risen to the top. Where are we at with starting discussions?
Can we get a survey before next week completed and part of our analysis?
Yeah, I mean, we've
Along
done it with
this
the
one?
housing commission relatively quickly when we were talking about different things, right, Sarah? Sorry.
Sounds like the room turned around.
I apologize.
Okay, formulating. With the housing commission, we turned it around in a week. And it's literally a survey that says you cannot have 2 number 1s and 2, you have to rank 1 through whatever it is.
Yeah.
We then is this what you're talking about? We then brought that to the housing commission and said, here is what those results are. Is there anything under, I don't remember what our number was, 5, that someone is so passionate about that needs to move up? And there wasn't. Folks saw where everyone else was. That's how we sorted through the billions of ideas for housing piece. And it was relatively simple to put together.
Yeah, and we have a dollar limit too. I think 75 is probably the max that we want to make a suggestion towards council. And so as that choice voting among ourselves will kind of help percolate with those dollar amounts, and then in our next meeting say, well, it's pretty obvious, you know, this is kind of where everybody's at. And we're already at 75 million, maybe we'll get blessed and be lucky, everyone's right at that dollar amount of 75, and then it's like, here we go, we're done. But, just to kind of try to make it easier and try to make a meeting to go, flow well at the next meeting. Because I would like to have one more slide of these rankings among community, committee, and staff. And what did that total rank points mean? Was that among all three identifiers, or was that just community, et cetera? But we'll see that from these slides, community, committee, / and staff.
So,
Yes.
Can I clarify what I think you're saying? Right now, these total rank points only reflect the community survey, so that
Right.
far left hand. Number one means that, there was 1,967 supporting points. Are you asking us to go through and add the committee members to that? No. I would say-
No, just to
Okay.
identify that as community.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Survey community, survey points, survey
Yeah,
us, survey points.
yep.
And yeah, maybe we just do it on the rank order number, you don't necessarily have to put in the points. You could just do the survey rank order. So like, it might say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right now, and then that other column might say like 2, 3, 1, 5, 4, or something like that.
so.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
in that column, are you asking us to assign, you're just looking at rank order 1, 2, 3, 4 for that column, right?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So.
I just wanted to make sure we knew what we were doing. I know you do, Shannon, but I wanted to make sure I did.
So if I understand what you're asking, it's, there's 30 projects. And they're 1, 2, 3, all the way to 30 on this side. Over here are those points. You want us to go down here and do a 1, 3, 5, 10, whatever, on each one.
I would do it based
Piece of
on,
cake, I can do that
I
right
would do it
now.
based on, separated, do it on the separated.
Well, it's on the whole,
I think you should do it on the separated one, I think it gives us a little more irons.
well,
We can do
so that was what I thought in the first place,
Right.
but by taking all the projects, I think we would be able to eliminate a few and then go into, because
From the bottom one, you're talking
Because
about.
when I present on my thoughts on this one, on stormwater and wastewater infrastructure, I'm gonna pick what I suggest we go for, and why not the rest, and why I think we can sell that to voters. If you look at, let's take public safety, because right now, I think that would be very easy. The wildland fire engine and water tankers, you could probably put 9 of them out there and have a 70-30 margin on them based on the tunnel fire. And so, I guess that initially, I think what Devon is suggesting is a smart idea, and then we can break it down, because each one of these is gonna end up on one of these sheets anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I have to dash, but it seems like both could be done. So like, we can have the committee's ranking added to that one that's on the screen there, and added to the full list of 30, like it's just another column that would just
It
say,
gives us more, it's
Yeah.
good.
it's kind of the same project, just seeing it too.
Otherwise, I think we're leaving things out that are important.
Yeah.
So,
And I would like us to do some homework, if possible, before our next meeting. For us, knowing everything, what community wants, what committee, staff, is do our own quick little ranking, as what they did in the housing commission. When they met, they said, okay, this was number 1 by majority. It was pretty obvious, just because the community wants it, committee overall wanted it, staff wanted it. And so it kind of helped narrow the field, and it will save us a lot of time when we meet next Thursday.
Should we email that to Mary?
Is that possible to have one last column?
Is that, so I don't know exactly how many projects are on here, so I'll have to count, but that last column then, this would be the piece that you fill out. The committee member is gonna rank 1 through, let's say there's 30 projects, you're gonna rank it 1, 2, 3, whatever's most important to you, 30.
So
Is that what you want?
Is that,
Maybe you can add up to, you can have it adding, as you add one in, is that possible? And then we know when we got to 75, otherwise you can just keep going.
I don't know that I'm that technical with
Yeah, I don't know if that's
Excel.
possible.
Ms. Starr?
There's a tool, there's an electronic tool that we can program it in and email it to the committee.
Okay.
That will let them force rank, and then it spits out all the numbers so that staff, you don't have to email it to us and we hope we get the numbers right. We can program it in, I think we use, I keep looking for Justina, she's online, it's not helpful. I think we use SurveyMonkey, and it's a forced ranking tool and it'll spit out their data. So if that's helpful, Shannon.
So what does everyone think about doing something like that before we meet?
I think it's hard to rank 1 through 30, because when you get to 26, 27, 28, they all
I know.
irrelevant.
Because
So
I think when you get to 3, there'll be 75 million and it'll be over.
Correct.
Well, I mean, even if that's the case, that gives us a good chunk that will get eliminated.
Because I think you're gonna get the top that are definites. I think you're gonna get the bottom that are like heck to the nose. And then you're gonna get the middle piece, which is where our discussion will lie. Like, is it up or is it down? Is it, we're asking the community for 76 million because it's important, or 72 million, or like, where do we wanna negotiate is probably in that middle piece. And this will help give us those middle pieces.
Right, okay. Is that doable, Ms. Anderson? And
how do we communicate this to email you? Is that the deal?
No, they're
No,
gonna
it
send
sounds
us.
like we're gonna set up a survey, so we'll send you a link.
Yeah.
And you're gonna fill it out, and the results will automatically be captured in SurveyMonkey, and then we'll have.
Cool. And we'll get this information too before we fill our own survey out.
Yeah, I'll work on this tonight and get it to you, so you'll have it
Yeah.
for your contemplation.
Yep.
And then once we get the survey designed, then we'll get that link out to you as well. I'll do them separately, so you're not having to wait to at least start your thinking.
Shannon, could you also, that's already be informed on what expenditures we think are being covered through the budget process? Related to fire trucks.
That's
Yeah.
I crossed out the ladder fire engine, I believe this is the updated number, but I will double check that, right?
Because we did hear something about radios too.
Radios, yeah.
Potentially, I think we probably want to get through all day tomorrow to make sure it stays on the list, or no?
Yeah, we can wait till tomorrow,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
keep in mind.
Yeah, this is not a
things
hurry.
going on.
We got till Thursday next week. I know it's short, but hopefully it's doable. I know. I know. So with that, we're after our time slot. Thank you to everybody for being a few minutes late. I think we have a good game plan of moving forward to get to a decision point. That has been well thought out, a lot of data behind it, a lot of thoughts behind it, and when a recommendation does come to a city council, whatever it is, it's been well vetted and therefore. So, any closing thoughts, Mr. Clifton?
Oh, I'm just really grateful. From the outside looking in, you guys are making great progress, and we always knew at the outset this is where it was going to get a little bit challenging.
Yeah.
And so understand that as you're laboring through that, this is the heavy lift. So, but I'm really impressed with the progress you're making.
Okay, thank you, and Vice Chair, any closing things for?
Ditto.
All right, so that's meeting adjourned, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Tell Mr. Smith, we're thinking of him, Steve.
I will. I will.
Yes.